Sloane arrived at her sister Odessa's wedding expecting to celebrate like any loving sibling would. Dressed in her best navy gown, she stepped into the luxury ballroom, only to discover the unthinkable. Her name wasn't listed among the guests in the main reception. Instead, she had been assigned a seat in the hallway, near the coat racks, far from the laughter and lights. At first, she believed it was a mistake. But one look at the smirk on Odessa's face confirmed the truth. It was deliberate. Her mother Vivian brushed it off, suggesting Sloane just be grateful she was even there. That was the moment Sloane realized she wasn't a guest. She was an afterthought. Not even her father spoke up for her. What should have been a joyful family occasion turned into public humiliation. They didn't just forget her, they erased her. And in that moment, Sloane stopped trying to belong. Because sometimes being excluded isn't the wound, it's the wake-up call. Sloane had spent her entire life playing the good daughter, the reliable one, the one who never asked for much but always showed up. So when her sister Odessa's wedding day arrived, Sloane dressed in her navy blue gown, smoothed her hair, and prepared to smile for the cameras, ready to fulfill her usual role. But the moment she walked into that lavish Chicago ballroom, beneath chandeliers and marble floors, she felt the shift. It wasn't just in the air, it was in her gut. Something was off. And then she saw it. Her assigned seat was not at the family table, not even in the main reception hall, but shoved outside near the coat racks like an afterthought. The wedding planner's faltering smile and forced professionalism only confirmed it. This wasn't an oversight. It was a message. And that message was clear. You don't belong. Sloane's hope that her mother, Vivian, hadn't signed off on this humiliation quickly vanished. When she confronted her, Vivian dismissed her pain with a wave of her manicured hand. We had to prioritize immediate family, she said, not realizing the cruelty of her words, or perhaps not caring. Even Odessa, radiant in white and basking in her curated spotlight, delivered her version of a smirk and a false sympathy, pretending to be oblivious. But Sloane saw through her, just like she always had. Still, something had changed in Sloane this time. She wasn't willing to swallow it anymore. The emotional neglect wasn't new. It had been there for years, in their mother's praises for Odessa's every move, in the forgotten birthdays, in the invisible accomplishments Sloane had racked up with no applause. It had been there the day Sloane found a leather-bound notebook in her mother's drawer filled with memories, quotes, and favorite things about Odessa, every intimate thought a mother might cherish. Sloane had flipped through it frantically, searching for her own name. She didn't find it. It was as if she had never existed. Her mother had smiled when she caught Sloane holding it. You've always been independent, she said, as if that explained the absence of love. But this moment at the wedding, the public exile to the hallway, was the culmination of all that quiet rejection. And yet, even in her bitterness, Sloane didn't expect what came next. Dominic, Odessa's soon-to-be husband, approached her quietly at the bar. There was unease in his voice, a crack in the foundation of the performance he was putting on. He asked her if Odessa ever spoke about him differently when he wasn't around. That's when Sloane realized he was seeing behind the curtain. She told him the truth gently but firmly, and it only took a moment before Celeste, Dominic's mother, stepped in with the evidence to confirm everything: text messages, insults, manipulations. Odessa had called Celeste overbearing. She had admitted to using Dominic for his family's wealth. She had confessed to training him and planning to play the part of loving wife just long enough to gain control. Dominic's expression hardened as he read the messages, and the man who had pledged forever minutes ago began to realize he didn't even know the woman standing beside him. The confrontation escalated quickly. In a private lounge, with family members summoned like jurors to a courtroom, the truth unraveled. Odessa scoffed, denied, and twisted. Vivian tried to smooth things over with her usual blend of charm and coercion. But Celeste wasn't having it. She laid down the facts. And finally, Sloane's father, Harold, spoke up. For the first time in Sloane's life, he acknowledged the truth. Sloane has been right all along. He said, "It hit like a thunderclap." Vivian tried to redirect, but Odessa couldn't control the room anymore. The illusion cracked, and then shattered. Dominic dropped the final blow. Annulment papers, already prepared. The gasp that swept through the family was real. So was the silence that followed. Odessa stood exposed, and when she lashed out, blaming Sloane, swinging at her in a fit of rage, it was Celeste who stepped in and blocked her, physically and metaphorically. In full view of the ballroom, the golden daughter, the perfect bride, unraveled. The mask fell, and no one came to her defense. It was only after everything imploded that Sloane realized what true peace felt like. Not triumph, not revenge, but clarity. The moment she stepped out of that ballroom into the cold night air, she knew she would never go back, not to the role, not to the silence, not to the pain. Her mother called afterward, left voicemails filled with half apologies and justifications. Sloane said nothing, because this wasn't about forgiveness. This was about freedom. She wasn't begging for a seat anymore. She was building her own table. And for the first time, she was no longer afraid to sit at it, alone, whole, and finally seen. As the tension simmered inside the lounge, the air around us thickened into a silence too sharp to ignore. I stood there, staring at the woman who had spent her whole life stealing the spotlight, distorting reality to suit her image, and reducing everyone around her into props in her never-ending performance. Odessa's voice cracked as she tried to reclaim control, lashing out at me with tired accusations, jealousy, bitterness, blame, but for the first time, her words landed on deaf ears. I had finally stopped playing the part she had written for me. The truth was already out. Her own mother-in-law had read aloud her vicious texts. Her manipulation of Dominic was exposed. And now every guest in that ballroom, once charmed by her curated perfection, was witnessing the unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. Odessa's pleading glance toward our mother was met with silence, and in that moment, the golden child of the Hathaway family stood alone for the very first time, her kingdom of illusion crumbling at her feet. Odessa's next move was desperation disguised as defiance. Her attempt to physically strike me, a last, reckless lunge, was intercepted by Celeste, who stood tall between us like a shield of steel wrapped in velvet. Odessa stumbled, off balance, propelled not by rage but by the force of her own collapse. She landed in full view of the ballroom, the once adored bride now gasping for composure under 100 pairs of judging eyes. The music stopped. Conversations froze. Champagne flutes hovered midair. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a reckoning, a public undoing. And while she sputtered, trying to rewrite the narrative yet again, Dominic calmly reached into his jacket and handed her an envelope that might as well have been a mirror. Annulment papers, a declaration that not only was her mask shattered, but the future she had plotted out, one built on lies and greed, was officially off the table. I didn't need to say much. The truth had done the talking. But as she looked at me, eyes wild, breath uneven, she begged one last time for our mother's validation. "Tell her she's wrong, Mom," she whispered, cracking under the weight of exposure. But Vivian didn't say a word. Not to her, not to me. Her silence, for once, wasn't complicit. It was shock, maybe guilt, maybe the realization that the daughter she'd always dismissed had finally drawn the line. When Odessa screamed, "This is all your fault," I didn't flinch, because this time I knew exactly who I was, and I wasn't her shadow anymore. I watched my sister unravel in front of the very people she had tried so hard to impress. No one stepped in. Not our father, not her bridesmaids, not even the guests who had once fawned over her. There was no script, left to follow. No Instagram filter to apply. No charm strong enough to smooth this one over. And when she finally looked back at me, something behind her eyes broke, like the moment a child realizes the magic trick isn't real. She muttered one last threat, one last attempt to reclaim control. "You'll regret this," she spat. But I didn't. I wouldn't. Because finally I had chosen myself. When I walked out of that ballroom, I didn't look back. The cold Chicago night air wrapped around me like clarity. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even shaking. I was free. The silence wasn't lonely, it was mine. I stood there in the courtyard, letting the breeze wash away the years of neglect, the constant comparison, the aching need to be enough. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove anything. Not to my mother, not to Odessa, not even to myself. I knew who I was now. And that woman, she didn't sit in hallways. She didn't beg for table scraps of love. She designed her own damn table, and she decided who got a seat. In the days that followed, my phone was flooded with messages. Some apologetic, some defensive, some from relatives trying to play both sides, and some just quietly observing the fallout. Odessa disappeared from social media, her once glowing presence now a void. And the family group chat carried on. Without me, I thought it might hurt, that I'd feel the sting of erasure again. But I didn't, because I'd stopped needing what they never truly gave. A call from Vivian came one night, her voice hesitant. "Hello, I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. And for once, I didn't offer a solution. There was nothing left to fix. Some wounds weren't meant to be patched. Some scars were meant to stay visible, reminders of the battles we had to fight just to be seen. Later that week, I stood by my bookshelf in my apartment and picked up an old family photo. Odessa was glowing in the center, Mom beside her, hand on her shoulder. Me, off to the edge, barely framed. I placed it face down, not out of anger, but because I was done living in the margins of other people's lives. The city lights flickered outside my window like possibility, like promises waiting to be written, and I knew this was where my story really began. So if you've ever been shoved aside, if you've ever sat quietly in a hallway while others laughed inside the ballroom, let me tell you this: you don't have to stay there. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to be seen. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away, not in anger, not in pain, but in power. Because choosing yourself, that's not weakness. That's survival. Here's a 960-word paragraph based on the content provided, and summary point number 4. The quiet tension inside the private lounge was suffocating, thick with the unspoken knowledge that something irreversible was happening. Sloane stood just inside the door, shoulders back, eyes locked on her mother and sister as the air between them vibrated with old resentments and new revelations. For years, she had played the role they assigned her, the quiet daughter, the dependable one, the outsider whose presence was tolerated but never truly welcomed. But tonight, that role shattered. Odessa stood in the center, flanked by the remnants of the illusion she had curated, her designer gown, her perfect posture, her performative grace. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to show. And then the truth surfaced, unraveling like the hem of a silk dress pulled too tight. Celeste, Dominic's mother, presented damning evidence. A string of text messages that revealed Odessa's true intentions, manipulation, greed, and a carefully planned future in which Dominic was nothing more than a stepping stone to wealth and social clout. It was brutal, but necessary. Sloane said nothing at first, watching Dominic's expression shift from confusion to betrayal to disillusionment. His silence hit harder than any accusation. It wasn't just Sloane who had been cast aside. It was all of them used for Odessa's gain. Harold, their father, spoke next, his words landing like thunder. "Sloane has been right all along," he said, finally choosing his quiet daughter over the golden child. The moment broke something in Vivian, their mother, whose denial had always been as polished as Odessa's smiles. She looked at Sloane like she was seeing her for the first time, not as a shadow of her sister, but as someone who had endured far more than anyone ever acknowledged. The room shifted then. Odessa, desperate to regain control, lashed out. She accused Sloane of jealousy, of always wanting to destroy her. But Sloane didn't flinch. She met her sister's venom with calm truth, her voice steady as she recounted years of manipulation, lies, and neglect. "You've always made sure I felt invisible," Sloane said. "But look around. You're the one no one sees anymore." And the silence that followed was louder than any scream. Vivian tried to defend Odessa, but even she faltered. The mother who had always championed her eldest daughter now stood suspended in her own guilt. Then Dominic stepped forward. Without ceremony, he revealed the annulment papers he had already prepared. Gasps rippled through the guests still lingering outside the lounge. The perfect wedding was unraveling in real time. But the devastation wasn't over. Dominic read a document confirming that Odessa had met with a divorce attorney 1 month before the wedding. She had planned to leave him the moment she had access to his wealth. That revelation broke whatever was left of Odessa's control. She spun toward Sloane, screaming that it was all her fault. But this time, no one defended her. Not Vivian, not Dominic, not even the guests who had once adored her. Odessa's mask cracked completely. She lunged at Sloane in a fit of rage, but Celeste stepped between them, stopping the attack. The force sent Odessa stumbling into the ballroom, right into the spotlight she had so desperately chased. Every eye turned toward her, messy, desperate, undone. She pleaded with Dominic, with her family, but no one moved. No one stood by her. Dominic's voice was calm. "Final, I don't think I ever really knew you." And in that instant, the wedding collapsed. The music stopped. The fairy tale ended. Sloane stood at the edge of it all, no longer in the shadows. Her truth had finally shattered the illusion that had kept her silent for years. She didn't gloat. She didn't cry. She simply turned and walked away, past the judgment, the whispers, the disbelief, out into the cool night air, where the city stretched wide and full of new beginnings. A week later, the silence from her family was deafening. Odessa had vanished from social media. Vivian left voicemails full of confusion and apologies, but none of them could undo the years of erasure. Sloane didn't need their explanations. She had stepped out of their script and found her own voice. And in doing so, she reclaimed her identity. She wasn't the extra limb in a perfect family photo anymore. She was her own person, seen, heard, and finally free. For Sloane, the aftermath of the wedding disaster wasn't loud or explosive. It was the kind of quiet that settled into your bones, a stillness that followed years of being overlooked, erased, and pushed to the margins. A week had passed since she walked out of the ballroom, not in anger, but in finality. And in that time, the dust hadn't settled. It had swirled, clung to the walls of every conversation in the family group chat, lingered in every voicemail from her mother, and echoed in the silence from Odessa. What Sloane felt wasn't vindication. It was clarity, a kind of emotional equilibrium that came only after you had risked everything, your place in the family, the illusion of belonging for the sake of your own truth. For the first time in her life, she wasn't desperate to be seen. She was content knowing that even if they never acknowledged her value, she had finally acknowledged it herself. Her phone buzzed constantly in the days after the wedding, missed calls, unread messages, some apologetic, others passive-aggressive, and most from her mother, "Vivian, you've made your point." One voicemail said, "Let's be adults." Another pleaded, but not a single one contained the word sorry. And Odessa? Silent. No Instagram story to spin the narrative, no TikTok clip to distract from reality, no hashtag to hide behind. Her curated world had collapsed, and with it, the myth of the golden child had cracked wide open. Sloane wasn't part of the cleanup crew this time. She didn't rush to smooth things over or silence herself for the sake of appearances. She let the silence speak for her. Still, the moment she saw Vivian's name flash on the screen, a familiar ache returned. Old habits died hard. For a second, she considered declining the call, letting it fade like so many others. But she answered. Her mother's voice came through, softer than usual. "I know I've made mistakes," she said, as if that could cover a lifetime. Sloane stayed quiet. What was there to say? "I just don't know how to fix this," Vivian murmured. Sloane could hear the fragility behind the words, the cracks in the armor. But she also knew this wasn't her burden to repair. She had always been the one holding things together, pretending everything was fine, offering olive branches while bleeding internally. Not this time. Later that evening, a different message came through. This one wasn't a plea or a guilt trip. It was an invitation. Dinner. A quiet gesture. An attempt, maybe, at something resembling peace. And for the first time, Sloane hesitated, not out of bitterness, but out of discernment, because now she knew that not every invitation was meant for her, and not every table was worth sitting at. She looked around her apartment, her sanctuary, and her gaze fell on the bookshelf near the window. Old photos sat in mismatched frames. One in particular caught her eye, a family Christmas photo from years ago. Odessa beamed at the center, Vivian close beside her, hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. Sloane? She was on the edge of the frame, half-lit, like a shadow. She set the photo down. She didn't need to carry that version of herself anymore. Walking to the window, she let the city stretch out before her. It didn't care about wedding disasters or ruined reputations. It just pulsed and moved, full of strangers who didn't expect her to perform or apologize for being who she was. Sloane breathed in the night air, sharp and real. This wasn't closure in the way she had once imagined. No tearful reunion, no fairy tale redemption, but it was peace. The kind you claim, not ask for. The group chat buzzed with life in the days that followed. Inside jokes, wedding memes, passive updates on Odessa's radio silence. Sloane watched it unfold from the outside, no longer desperate to be included. They hadn't kicked her out this time. She had walked out. And that made all the difference. The call she didn't expect came on a Wednesday. Celeste, Dominic's mother. Her voice was calm, polished. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "Most people wouldn't have had the courage to say anything. You didn't just save my son from a mistake. You gave him clarity." Sloane was quiet for a moment. "I didn't do it for him," she said gently. "I did it because I finally stopped doing things for everyone else." Celeste understood. There was no more to say. A week later, Sloane was back in her routine. She returned to work, picked up her dry cleaning, watered her plants, and went for long evening walks without checking her phone every 10 minutes. Her life wasn't glamorous. It wasn't curated or branded, but it was hers. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she walked past a bakery she hadn't visited in years. On impulse, she stepped inside and ordered 2 croissants. As she waited, she texted Tanya, her oldest friend, the one who never asked her to shrink herself to fit. "Coffee and carbs tomorrow," she wrote. The reply came fast. "Always." Back home, she took the second croissant, wrapped it in wax paper, and placed it in the fridge. Not out of loneliness, but out of hope, because Sloane was finally creating space, not for the family that never saw her, but for the life that would. That night, as Sloane sat alone in the hallway just beyond the elegant ballroom, its golden lights and soft laughter filtering through like a cruel reminder. She came face to face with a truth she'd buried for years. She had spent her entire life bending, shrinking, and compromising to be seen by a family that had already decided she wasn't worthy of inclusion. The seat placement wasn't a mistake. It was a message. It said, "You are convenient but not cherished, obligated but not loved." For decades, she played the good daughter role, silent, dependable, always in the background, while Odessa, the golden child, commanded every spotlight. But now, humiliated at the very wedding she helped support, Sloane felt something shift. The years of being sidelined, of overhearing whispered comparisons, of watching her accomplishments brushed off like dust, all of it erupted within her, not in anger, but in resolve. She stood up, not to demand space at a table that had already excluded her, but to make it known she would never beg for it again. When Dominic, Odessa's husband-to-be, approached Sloane moments later, it was clear something wasn't right. He wasn't glowing with joy, but heavy with hesitation, his eyes full of unspoken questions. He asked quietly whether Odessa spoke differently about him when he wasn't around. That moment cracked the porcelain image Odessa had so carefully crafted. Sloane, for the first time, told the truth without fear. Yes, Odessa lied. Yes, she manipulated. And yes, this marriage was more about image and inheritance than love. Celeste, Dominic's mother, had already seen through Odessa's facade. With damning texts in hand, messages where Odessa trashed Dominic, mocked his family, and revealed plans to control him, Celeste handed Dominic the truth his heart already knew. That was the match that ignited the unraveling. What followed in the private lounge was the slow but stunning collapse of Odessa's carefully built empire. Harold, Sloane and Odessa's father, finally spoke, not as a passive observer, but as a man reckoning with his failures. For the first time in Sloane's life, he publicly chose her. He said the words she had longed to hear. "Sloane has been right all along." And Vivian, their mother, flinched, not because she didn't know it, but because she had allowed it. She had enabled Odessa's behavior for years, brushing aside Sloane's pain under the guise of keeping the peace. But now the cost of that peace was undeniable. It had turned their daughter into someone unrecognizable. Odessa's reaction was fierce and expected. She accused, deflected, and even tried to strike Sloane in front of everyone. But this time, Sloane didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Celeste blocked the blow, and the chaos spilled into the ballroom, where the perfect bride was suddenly exposed as anything but. Guests stared in shock, the music stopped, and the illusion shattered. In a final act of control, Dominic pulled out annulment papers, documents prepared before the wedding, confirming that he too had seen enough. Odessa, stunned, turned to Sloane in desperation. "This is all your fault," she screamed, but Sloane just looked back, calm and unshaken. "No, Odessa, this is who you've always been." That truth, spoken plainly and without malice, was the final nail in Odessa's image. The wedding was over, not just the ceremony, but the narrative Odessa had constructed her entire life. Her own mother, silent and trembling, could no longer protect her. Her husband walked away. Her guests murmured, not in admiration, but in disbelief. Sloane didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The truth had spoken for itself. She simply walked out. No dramatic farewell, no lingering stare, just the quiet decision of a woman who had finally chosen herself over a family that had never truly chosen her. In the days that followed, Sloane didn't wait for apologies. She didn't sift through family group chats filled with noise and false cheer. Instead, she sat in her apartment in the stillness she once feared but now welcomed. Her mother called, offering soft regrets dressed as accountability, but Sloane knew the damage wasn't hers to fix. Invitations came. Dinner, reconciliation, attempts to return to normal, but Sloane didn't respond out of anger. She declined because peace built on performance wasn't peace at all. She didn't need to sit at a table where she had to shrink to fit. She had built her own table now, one where truth, respect, and boundaries sat in every seat. Looking at old photos, Christmas gatherings where Odessa always stood center frame, while Sloane lingered on the edge, she no longer felt the sting. She felt clarity. Those photos weren't memories. They were warnings. And now, in this new season of her life, Sloane chose freedom not as revenge, but as healing. She opened the window, letting the city breeze fill the room, and realized she was finally breathing for herself. The family lounge had never felt more suffocating than in that moment, with Odessa standing in the center like a wilting statue, her carefully constructed persona unraveling at the seams. Sloane stood across from her, no longer trembling, no longer silent, no longer waiting to be acknowledged. Years of being pushed aside had hardened into a quiet resilience that now held the room's attention. The confrontation wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It was the stillness in Sloane's voice, the calm finality of her words, that carried weight. "You played your game well," she said, looking directly at her sister. "But you forgot one thing. I know who you really are." Odessa flinched, not dramatically, but enough for everyone present to notice. Her lips parted, but no rebuttal came. For once, she had no script, no polished line to recite, and no doting mother rushing to smooth things over. The truth, long buried under glitter and manipulation, had finally surfaced, and it stood on Sloane's side. Vivian's eyes welled with tears, but Sloane knew they weren't for her, not yet. They were for what Vivian had allowed to fester in her silence. The favoritism, the constant erasure of one daughter to elevate another, the endless excuses made for Odessa's cruelty. Sloane wasn't seeking pity or revenge. She was seeking clarity. And now, with the spotlight off the wedding chaos and squarely on the family's dysfunction, she had it. Dominic, stunned by the betrayal revealed through text messages and a trail of deceit, didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The way he looked at Odessa, exhausted, disillusioned, hollow, was louder than any accusation. He handed her the annulment papers without flinching, not in anger, but in release. Celeste, his mother, watched with razor-sharp composure, her eyes unblinking as the fantasy her son had been sold crumbled in real time. "You were never going to be part of this family," she told Odessa, each syllable deliberate, unapologetic. It wasn't cruelty, it was a boundary long overdue, and Odessa, now fully exposed, had no one left to manipulate. Her power was built on illusion, and that illusion had shattered. As she stumbled back, gasping, pleading to anyone who might still be on her side, all she met were blank stares, crossed arms, and pursed lips. Even Vivian, her lifelong enabler, could no longer hold the facade. She stood frozen, arms wrapped around herself, realizing the daughter she'd favored had become a stranger even to her. Sloane didn't move. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The quiet victory wasn't in Odessa's downfall. It was in Sloane's refusal to be silent anymore. The moment Odessa accused her of jealousy for the 1,000th time, Sloane didn't rise to the bait. She simply answered, "This is who you've always been." The room heard it. They believed it. And Odessa felt the weight of it. Her final outburst, raw, cracked, and venomous, was met with stillness. Her world had finally stopped orbiting around her, and now she was just another guest at a wedding that was no longer hers. The annulment was just the beginning. Sloane stepped away, not because she was running, but because she was done standing still. She left the lounge without fanfare, her head high, the past trailing behind her like shadows at dusk. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't need closure. What she had gained was far more powerful: freedom. The city air greeted her like a bomb, cool and indifferent, the noise of the night cleansing her lungs of years of suppressed breath. The girl who once fought for a seat at the family table had finally learned she didn't need one. She could build her own table, write her own story, and start her life from a place of self-worth, not obligation. And that made all the difference. Back in the ballroom, the celebration staggered forward like a puppet with cut strings, the music shallow, the laughter strained. No one dared look at Odessa directly anymore. She had become a cautionary tale, not a centerpiece. Days later, the calls began, Vivian's tear-stained voicemails, Odessa's radio silence, the family chat humming along as if nothing had happened. But Sloane didn't answer, not out of spite, but peace. She sat on her apartment balcony with a cup of coffee and the city skyline in front of her, finally aware that she had nothing left to prove. She had survived the betrayal, the exclusion, the quiet erasure, and emerged whole. When she opened the invitation from her mother to meet for dinner, she stared at it not with bitterness, but clarity. Choosing herself wasn't a rebellion anymore. It was a right. She placed the invite in a drawer she no longer opened and smiled. She wasn't the villain. She wasn't the side character. She wasn't even the forgotten daughter anymore. She was simply, finally, free. And in that freedom, she found her voice, her strength, her name. Not spoken for her, not whispered behind closed doors, but declared by her own heart, loud and unwavering. The story hadn't ended with Odessa's fall. It had begun with Sloane's rise. And that story, her story, was only just beginning. This story delivers a powerful message about self-worth, boundaries, and the painful but necessary act of walking away from those who continuously devalue you, even when they're family. Sloane's journey teaches us that love without respect is not love at all, and that sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is choose ourselves over the roles others force us to play. It reminds us that silence isn't always strength, and speaking up can be the first step toward healing. True family isn't defined by blood, but by the people who see and value you for who you are. If this story touched something in you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more real and raw stories like this, and drop a comment to share your experience or let us know where you're watching from. Your voice matters, and you're not alone.